The Government Accountability Project. We have with us today two outstanding scholars, Steve Horwitz, who is the Charles A. Downer Professor of Economics at St. Lawrence University in Canton, New York. He completed his MA and his PhD in Economics at George Mason University and earned his AB in Economics and Philosophy from the University of Michigan. He's the author of two books, Micro Foundations and Macroeconomics, An Austrian Perspective, and Monetary Evolution, Free Banking and Economic Order. He is a person who is well recognized for the work that he's done on public policy, and he has in recent years done a lot of work on Katrina, and it's on that Katrina work that he will speak to you this afternoon. He's joined by our own, He's joined by our own Eileen Norcross, who has been with us for 5 years. She's done economic research in a wide range of fields during that period of time and is one of our top researchers. She earned her degree at Rutgers and has specialized in looking at whether or not government policy is producing the expected benefits by doing strenuous or rigorous economic analysis. Can I just open today by saying to you, so why all of this study on Katrina? And in my view, part of that really has to go to saying if the response to Katrina wasn't very effective, and I think learning from the lessons of Katrina is what our scholars are trying to do, and put in front of you what some of the options are and how some groups within society were able to respond much more effectively and positively than others. In the end, if we went back to the philosophy of James Lee Witt when he was at the head of FEMA, I think we would be much more effective. And as far as James Lee Witt was concerned, there was only one criteria that was important at FEMA, and that was putting back together the lives of individuals and communities, and to doing that as quickly as possible. So sometimes we see in government delivery organizations an extreme reticence to take risk. And in that denial of taking risk, we also deny services. So in some instances, it might be better to take the risk, as James Lee Witt was prepared to do, and venture out and move quickly, and accept that from time to time mistakes will be made, but it is much better to have responded quickly and to have put people's lives back together quickly rather than to guarantee that no mistake will be made. Because in guaranteeing that no mistake will be made, maybe we're also guaranteeing that nothing will happen. Can I also just, before I hand over to Steve Horwitz, ask you to bear in mind that in the first week of June, we will have a course up here on the Hill on credit and markets. And that will be done by Bruce Yandel as part of his quarterly update on the economic scene in the United States. In mid-June, we'll have another course on the effects of high oil prices on the economy. And towards the end of July, we'll be putting together a compendium release on publications on the private sector's response to Katrina. So please look out for those events. My pleasure now to hand over to Steve Horwitz.
Thank you, Morris, and good afternoon, everyone. What I want to do today is talk a little bit about making hurricane response more effective. And I'm going to focus on lessons from the private sector and more specifically Walmart, but I'll talk about some other folks as well, and then the Coast Guard and their performance during Katrina. As Morris just said, the guiding theme here is what worked and what didn't during Katrina. We know very much about the failures of FEMA, but I don't think the story of the successful things that happened during Katrina have been talked about enough, and that's certainly what I want to do in my time today. So I really want to cover four things. I just want to refresh your memories on just how bad it was during Katrina. I want to talk a little bit about what exactly Walmart, the other big boxes, and the Coast Guard did that was so great. I want to spend some time talking about why. Why were these organizations able to respond so effectively when FEMA and others struggled? And then finally, what are the implications for disaster relief policy as we move forward? Again, as Morris said, what's next? What do we do next time? Hopefully we don't have something this bad, but again, having seen the more hurricane and earthquake problems around the world, it's likely that we will. So just to refresh your memory, Katrina, of course, at one point was a Category 5 storm. When it hit the Gulf Coast east of New Orleans, it was down to 125-mile-an-hour winds. And you can see the kind of damage. That's a little small, but definitely. And up to 20 feet of water in some places can go into St. Bernard Parish and east of the city. Just amazing damage there. About 2,000 dead, maybe less now. The numbers keep fluctuating a bit. Most important for my purposes today, a number of folks, many folks homeless, and many without basic supplies, especially in the poorest areas of the city of Lower Ninth and other places. And FEMA doesn't arrive with supplies and meaningful relief for days, if not weeks, after the flooding takes place. And so the question is, what did work? Something had to happen here. Many of the reports we saw in the media of the violence and looting and all these sorts of things turned out to be not true. In fact, relief did happen, and people were getting help. And Walmart and other folks were among the major organizations responsible for that. So what exactly did they do? Looking at Walmart specifically, from August 29th, basically the day that the storm hit, until September 16th, Walmart shipped 2,500 truckloads of supplies, including 3 prescriptions, to places as far away as Houston, both in the New Orleans area, to the east along the Gulf, and all the way as far west as Houston. Some stuff they gave away, some was sold. The company also made $17 million in cash donations to to Katrina relief organizations in the Gulf Coast. Just to talk about another folks here, Home Depot provided more than 800 trucks worth of supplies. Again, some donated, some sold to the hard-hit areas. And they also got a fleet of buses together and transported 1,000 of their employees from other areas into the Gulf so that they could get stores reopened and up and running again. One of the most important things that Walmart did was they had 126 stores damaged to some degree by the storm or flooding along the Gulf Coast. Within 10 days of landfall, 111 of those 126 stores were open to some degree or another. And that was crucial. Being able to reopen those stores, to get supplies into people's hands, to begin to rebuild that quickly. Walmart was reopening stores in many cases before FEMA had really provided meaningful relief in any way. And one of the keys to this is that Walmart was prepared ahead of time. Walmart, like many other large corporations, employs a director of business continuity, sort of an emergency operations person, whose job it is to sort of oversee all the bad things that can happen. Next time you're in Walmart, if you shop there, kind of while you're waiting in line right at the register, look at where the cashier looks, and you'll see a color-coded chart there that sort of has every bad thing that can happen at a Walmart, from a fire to somebody hurting themselves, and all these kinds of things. And they're sort of color-coded, and they can actually press a button and send that information directly to the Emergency Ops Center in Bentonville so that the company knows exactly what's happening in all their stores at the same time. Well, having that for just everyday purposes turned out to be very useful during the storm. Walmart is used to doing this kind of work. For example, they also hire their own private weather forecasters. They contract with weather forecasting companies. They were predicting the severity of Katrina before the National Weather Service and others had, and so they were prepared to do this. About a week ahead of the storm hitting the Gulf Coast, Walmart was already gearing up, as was Home Depot and others, to deal with the consequences of the storm. And one of the most important things that happened was Lee Scott, the CEO, had a meeting with his senior vice presidents and gave the following message to them and asked them to pass that down to their staffs. What Scott said was, a lot of you are going to have to make decisions above your level. Make the best decision you can with the information that's available to you at the time, and above all, do the right thing. And so he empowered local folks to make decisions in this situation. And one of the key things that happened with Walmart and others as well is that individual store managers responded to the very localized situations that they found themselves in. Let me give you a couple of examples. In Kenner, Louisiana, an employee used a forklift to knock open a warehouse door in order to get water for a local retirement home. It basically broke into his own store. In Marrero, Louisiana, employees allowed local police to use the store as headquarters for sleeping, as many had lost their homes and didn't have other places to stay. And my favorite story, in Waveland, Mississippi, the assistant manager couldn't reach any of her superiors to get authorization. And she also ran a bulldozer through her store. But what she did was she ran a bulldozer through and sort of collected, and all the supplies that were sort of strewn about that were still usable, piled them into a big pile in the parking lot and just gave them away to local residents. She also broke into their locked pharmacy to get critical drugs for a local hospital. All these actions were praised by Walmart's leadership as examples of store managers doing the right thing and responding effectively to these local situations. And so one of the keys for Walmart was the empowering of their employees in this way, which sort of runs against the image of Walmart as a sort of hierarchical, anonymous institution that we often see. And importantly, local folks appreciated this. A couple of quotes from people in the immediate aftermath of the storm. If the American government, the federal government, had responded like Walmart, we wouldn't be in this crisis. The only lifeline in Kenner, Louisiana was Walmart. We didn't see mass looting there because Walmart showed up with food and water so we could survive. And so there's sort of these stacks of Walmart water that went out. And there's Walmart sort of setting up a tent store in the middle of a parking lot after a storm had been damaged. Those two quotes, by the way, are from local politicians, well, from the sheriff of Jefferson Parish and then the mayor of Kenner, the second one. Interviews that folks at Mercatus did with the local residents, many mentioned that the reopening of Walmart again brought this sense of normalcy, not to mention the supplies that they tested. So what about the Coast Guard? The Coast Guard during the immediate aftermath mobilized over 5,000 personnel, 62 aircraft, 30 cutters, 111 small boats. And by September 11, so within the first 2 weeks, they rescued more than 24,000 people and assisted with the evacuation of an additional 9,400 patients and medical personnel from hospitals. Again, here too, a quote from local folks, and this is in St. Bernard's Parish, just east of New Orleans. The Coast Guard was the only federal agency to provide any significant assistance for a full week after the storm. Okay, so the question is why and how? What made it possible for these organizations to respond so effectively? People who do disaster research talk about the need for disaster response to be agile and disciplined. And that's an interesting combination. You need to be quick, you need to think on your feet, react, but you also need to be disciplined. You can't just sort of do everything. You've got to figure out what priorities are. And engaging to be agile and disciplined in this context requires that you have the right incentives and the right knowledge at hand. You need to know both what do people need and you need the incentives to provide it effectively. Getting those incentives and knowledge requires that you have the right institutional and political environment. Some kinds of organizations will have them, some kind won't, depending on the environment in which they operate. And so one of the distinctions we might talk about here, the knowledge and incentives and how they differ between public and private institutions, but also between centralized and decentralized institutions. And one of the points I want to emphasize today is that one of the key advantages of Walmart, Home Depot, and the Coast Guard was the degree of decentralization that they had, the degree to which they authorized the sort of lower-level personnel to make important decisions. That provided the agility that good disaster really requires. And so one way we can think about this, so a little 2x2 matrix. Economists love 2x2 matrix. It's just part of it in our genetics. And we can sort of across the top talk about centralized, decentralized organizations. Do you have this local knowledge? Do you not have it? Do you have it? Are you agile and flexible? Then we can also talk public versus private and the way in which incentives play a role here. What are the incentives facing public organizations in the sort of competition for power and larger budgets versus private organizations who are disciplined either by the means of profit or by sort of, if they're non-profit in competition for funds. And we can sort of fill in at least 3 of those 4 sectors and sort of look at FEMA as an example of a more centralized organization in the public sector. The Coast Guard becomes public sector, yeah, but more decentralized with a structure that enabled it to respond more effectively. And then we have the private sector, folks like Walmart and Home Depot. And the argument that I make is that as we move sort of from the northwest to the southeast across this matrix, sort of moving this way, disaster response is better. And both the Coast Guard and Walmart responded better than FEMA did. So, why? This is my text-based slide here. I think there's sort of 3 major topics we want to talk about when we talk about why we see this success. The first is this issue, what we might call profits, politics, and long-term planning. One of the advantages that the private sector has over the public sector is that private sector actors have a longer time horizon, and the feedback they have is faster. Firms are in it for the long haul. You can buy and sell your ownership in firms, and so anytime a firm makes a decision, it has to think about the long-term value of its assets and stock and so on. In addition, firms tend to get very quick feedback. If a firm makes a mistake, right, it sees changes in its profits or losses fairly immediately. In the political process, the time horizon is much shorter. 2 years perhaps, 4 years, maybe 6 years at the most. The next election is the time horizon, both for certainly elected politicians, but often for agencies as well. A change in political leadership might mean a change in mission, a change in resources as well. In addition, so that's a short time horizon, and the feedback, the sort of moment-to-moment feedback is much slower. You don't get that instantaneous response if you make a mistake. You have to wait for the next election sort of vote the bad guys out or change, sort of have the new guys put new people into agencies and the like. So the process there is much slower. One of the other important points is because of this, mitigating disasters, and disaster researchers focus on the need to sort of engage in preventative action. Preventative action, it turns out, is more in the private sector's self-interest. For political actors, spending money on mitigation is spending resources now for a potential benefit later. And political actors generally would rather be able to benefit their constituents now than later. Why? The actions today that lead to benefits in the future don't have quite the sort of the payoff in terms of elected self-interest that other kinds of uses of resources would. One other point here, too. One of the things that we saw during the response to Katrina or didn't see, was price gouging. The private sector firms, in fact, kept prices relatively stable. They didn't raise prices in the course of the crisis. And it's interesting why. First of all, Walmart has a policy since 2004 that whenever they declare an area a hurricane area, they have a self-imposed policy that they will not raise prices of their sort of necessities. And so once it was clear that Katrina was going to be a problem, they implemented that policy. But there were no reports of price gouging. And the response is interesting. One of the vice presidents at Home Depot said, if we can be there when a customer needs us most, we can win that customer for life. And so for them, they want to be able to respond in ways that their customers think are important. If they alienate customers by engaging in price gouging, that hurts them in the long run. And executives from Walmart point out that, look, we are part of the community too. We want a community to go back to in the end. And again, Home Depot, I can't think of a quicker way to lose customers than price gouging. And so the long-run interests of private sector firms enable them to not only provide relief, but to do it in ways that were helpful to the community. We talked a little bit about risk and agility, and in his introduction, Morris sort of, I think, really hit on the issue here, which is what we might call the distinction between areas of commission and omission. Political organizations have a reason not to want to make mistakes. If they make overt mistakes, if they commit an error, if they take that risk and go in and make a mistake, that mistake is obvious and oftentimes heavily punished through the political process. If simply you don't do something that you might have done, you don't take a risk that might have paid off, you didn't do anything wrong, but you simply missed an opportunity to do something better. And so one of the things we see with FEMA has been a reluctance to take those kind of risks because the punishment for taking those risks is much greater than the potential reward. And additionally, errors of omission, if they don't do something that they should have done, political actors can say, well, look, we just didn't have the resources to do that. It's not that we made any mistakes. If we go in and try to take that risk and make a mistake, then it might be that we committed an error of some sort. But if it's an error of omission, it's, well, we didn't have the resources. We couldn't do that because we didn't have the money. And so it becomes a very easy way to say, look, we could do better if we simply had more resources. So the incentive structure here works against the public sector agencies taking those kinds of risks. None of that applies in the private sector. Private sector firms have the incentive to take those risks. The payoff to them is much more, is greater. Let me say a couple words about decentralization and organizational culture. Again, Walmart allowed their managers and assistant managers to act at discretion. And one of the reasons they're able to do that, Walmart has a very powerful organizational culture. You've probably seen these clips of the Walmart cheer and the way that they sort of get their employees to sort of buy into this kind of rah-rah attitude about the company. It seems kind of cheesy and silly, but it has a really powerful effect that Walmart employees understand the company's values and are committed to it, and that enables Walmart executives to trust that their associates will do the right thing in these kinds of situations. And in fact, for the most part, they did. And the Coast Guard, is much the same way, particularly compared to FEMA. The Coast Guard has a culture, a very strong culture, a 200-year culture. And if you look at some of their founding documents, they focus on things like on-scene initiative. That's sort of allowing the people who are on the scene to have the initiative to make their best judgment, guided by their overall understanding of the mission about what to do. The Coast Guard also empowers pilots of boats to be in charge of that vessel, even if there's higher-ranking officers on board. So a sort of lieutenant can be in charge of superior officers if the lieutenant is piloting the boat. And again, these sort of examples came into play during Katrina, as the Coast Guard often had to make these on-the-spot decisions, connect up with local folks. And again, the other point I would raise here, too, is that the Coast Guard operates these local offices all throughout the areas where they tend to work during a hurricane response. They have local connections. Coast Guard officers often spend several years in a rotation in a particular place. They get to know the community. They have the local knowledge, the local connections. The only folks that FEMA is local to are folks here in D.C. Rather than in the particular places that they operate. And so the decentralized structure of the Coast Guard enabled it to function more effectively. So what are the implications for policy? Well, we mentioned 5, and I'll just be very brief. The first is to ensure that private sector responses are a recognized part of disaster protocol. So we're seeing movement in this direction at the state and community level. Finding ways to make sure that local, both politicians, but also local police officers and others know that private sector firms are authorized to act and sort of bring supplies in during a disaster. One of the things we saw happen during Katrina is that Walmart and others were turned back or diverted by either local folks or oftentimes by FEMA because they didn't have authorization or they weren't were trying to secure the area or thought the resources should be used in other places. Coordinating ahead of time and understanding that these private sector organizations have a role to play, getting private sector organizations involved in community and local conversations about disaster response, and getting local political folks into the war rooms with Home Depot and Walmart to understand how they respond. That kind of cross communication here is crucial. In whatever ways we can, increase the decentralization of government relief. Try to get funds in the hands of local communities. Try to do things through vouchers rather than in-kind transfers. Empower individuals and organizations at the local level so that it be possible to make decisions about how to respond. Consider moving the Coast Guard and FEMA out of the Department of Homeland Security. I would just say a couple things about this. The question here is whether or not the sort of urge to talk about disaster relief in the context of Homeland Security issues and it's sort of overlapping with concerns about terrorism is understandable. But there's differences between those kinds of responses, and a concern is whether keeping the Coast Guard and FEMA under DHS will lead to a reduction, certainly in the Coast Guard's decentralization, and a diversion of FEMA's resources into other kinds of concerns rather than towards disaster. And so that's a third recommendation. Last, clarify the Good Samaritan laws. At the state level, states have laws that protect people who attempt to sort of help others in a crisis and shield them from liability if their intentions appear to be good. The problem with these laws is the status of most of them exempt people who are acting for money, who are being paid to do what they do. And so the status of private sector firms like Walmart isn't clear. If you're a Walmart employee trying to help someone during a disaster, are you a commercial actor or are you a Good Samaritan? And Katrina and some other events recently have raised this question. A number of states are trying to clarify their Good Samaritan laws so that those problems hopefully will not be there if there is the next time. Overall, this is recognizing that better leadership or more disaster expertise is not the answer. The problem that we're facing here has to do with the way that institutions are structured, the incentives and knowledge that those institutions are able to provide by whether they're public-private or centralized or decentralized. Just trying to get a better person in charge without making some fundamental changes in the way we respond to natural disasters is akin to rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Right? That's not the problem. The problem is that big iceberg sitting up. So let me finish with what I think is a very quick summary of what we saw during Katrina and the difference between public and private sector disaster response. Here's public sector response. I probably can't read it, but it says, FEMA hung up on me. They said they were too busy to help. And there's our friendly neighborhood Walmart. Thank you.
I'm here today to talk a bit about the Road Home Program, which is the program that the state of Louisiana designed to award community development block grant dollars to homeowners who suffered either property damage or the loss of their home as a result of Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. I had the opportunity to go down to New Orleans in November of last year to interview some of the people, the recipients, and those who are waiting on these funds, and talk about their experiences with the program. For some background, the The 2005 Gulf hurricanes damaged about 300,000 homes throughout the Gulf. The kinds of damage suffered in Louisiana and Mississippi, as we heard in the last presentation, differed slightly. In Louisiana, what you had post-hurricane was sort of what one journalist has termed the jack-o'-lantern effect, that the floodwaters that rushed into these neighborhoods wiped away some houses and left others intact. In Mississippi, you had more total devastation with entire sections being erased. So the greater magnitude of destruction, you could say, definitely was brought on Louisiana and in particular in New Orleans. An early policy goal was identified, and that was to compensate property owners, making up the gap for what insurance did not provide them. So there was a federal allocation sent down to the Gulf of community development block grant dollars. Louisiana got about $10.4 billion in total, Mississippi $5.52 billion, and smaller allocations to the other states. In Mississippi, you had one particular scenario, which is about 68,000 homes destroyed or damaged. A much larger magnitude of destruction on Louisiana, with about 205,000 homes destroyed or damaged. 65% of 147,000 New Orleans properties were flooded, and over half of them sustained severe damage. Mississippi and Louisiana depart at this point in terms of how they decide to award grant dollars to homeowners. In Mississippi, early on, they came out with very narrow eligibility criteria, tightly identifying who should get aid. And the criteria that they developed was to compensate people who relied to their detriment on inaccurate NFIP flood maps. That is, there were people who were told, you're not living in a flood zone, you don't need to go out and purchase insurance. These people were relying on inaccurate government-provided information. So Mississippi establishes clear culpability, government responsibility for why these people are going to get aid. They calculated about 31,000 homeowners lived outside of a designated flood zone. In spite of that, some of these people purchased flood insurance anyway, 19,000. Another 7,800 carried some form of flood insurance. So Mississippi decided we're going to target these people first. Another primary distinction is they attach no strings to these grant dollars, saying you can do whatever you want with your funds. You can repair your home, you can use it for college tuition, you can go on a vacation, because they recognized in the planning documents that post-disaster, people have had to dip into all kinds of savings and funds to get on with their lives. So they didn't try to engineer what people should do with this grant. And they do attach a covenant to the funds if the homeowner decides to rebuild their home. They say you must carry insurance in perpetuity on your property and build according to code. Then Mississippi decided, when they saw that they would have funds left over, to extend the program. They entered into phase 2. November 2006, they expand the program to include those people who lived inside or outside of a floodplain. So if you're living inside a designated floodplain, you should have carried flood insurance. Mississippi acknowledges that some of these people suffered as well. We have extra dollars. We will expand the program, reduce the maximum amount of the award. Initially, in phase 1, the maximum award was $150,000. Here they reduced to $100,000. And then they applied the same formula, but put a 30% penalty for failure to carry insurance. Now, this is a picture that you can see in the paper. Essentially, just shows the timelines of when Mississippi started their program, when Louisiana started theirs. Mississippi started far sooner and basically had managed to get to everyone in phase 1 by November of 2006. This is at the point where Road Home in Louisiana, which I'll now start talking about, is just getting underway. In August 2006 is when Louisiana opened the doors on its Road Home program. Now, the Road Home program departs significantly from the Mississippi model. Early on in negotiations with the federal government, Louisiana had a disagreement and said that they decided they needed to include people who had just suffered wind damage as a result of the hurricanes. This went against federal advice. This later will come back to haunt Louisiana because they start to include people who should have been carrying homeowners insurance, and also people who were located nowhere near the levees towards the center of the state. They also decided that they were going to use the program to try to entice people to remain in Louisiana by affixing an exit penalty on those people who decide to sell their home to the state and leave Louisiana. You get a 40% reduction in your Road Home grant. Early on, Louisiana also decided to establish an escrow account in order to minimize on waste, fraud, and abuse. They decided they wanted to ensure that homeowners would only use the grant for home repairs. So once you're awarded your road home grant, they decided they were going to put the funds in an escrow account, and people would draw down that account as they completed work and produced receipts proving that they had completed a repair job. Later, this feature is eliminated. They also established very complex ID verification procedures to ensure that the money would not be wasted or to minimize on fraud. And also they allowed additional affordable housing goals to get attached to the CDBG funds. Louisiana, the exit penalty, talk about that a little bit more. As I just mentioned, once they calculate the amount of the grant that you're eligible for, which is based on the pre-storm value of your home, Louisiana would subtract any insurance payouts, additional government funding, just like Mississippi, but then apply a penalty for failing to have insurance and an exit penalty if you should leave the state or decide to rent. They put in an exception for the elderly, so they would not get that 40% penalty. The question is, did this penalty entice people to stay in Louisiana? Was it necessary? Louisiana has a very high nativity rate. That is, most people who are born in Louisiana, upwards of, I think, 71% of people, decide to stay in Louisiana. This is as of this month. As of now, most people have elected to stay and fix their homes who have applied to the program and been given a grant. A smaller percentage of them have decided to sell their homes to the state but buy another one in Louisiana. These people do not get a penalty. The people who suffer the penalty, those who sell and leave Louisiana or rent, about 2,310 of these people have elected that option. To date, the program has disbursed about $6.3 billion, the average grant amount about $58,000. About 180,000 people have applied to Road Home, and 156,000 of them have been declared eligible. And to date, there are about 50,000 people who are still waiting on their Road Home award, and we're approaching nearly the 3rd anniversary of Katrina. Some of these people, I should mention not an anniversary, but an important date is approaching, which is June 1st. This is the date when people are going to be moved out of the FEMA trailers. Some of these people are still waiting on their Road Home money, and they're going to be moved into apartments in the interim. Another decision, as I mentioned earlier, Louisiana decided to cover wind damage, which, as I mentioned, is an event that should be covered by homeowners insurance. What this did is early on it contributed to a shortfall in dollars. It added about $3 to $6 billion to the program. And the program became aware of this as it started processing applications. They said, whoa, we're running out of money. But another effect, which I think is interesting, is that it deconcentrated the effect of the dollars by spreading them all over the state and over time, rather than concentrating them quickly on the most devastated areas, for which you had a clear rationale for providing relief. So it added applicants to the system and slowed it down. And people who were towards the middle of the state, who didn't suffer this kind of severe damage, had their documents, had their papers, could apply quickly and get their grant pretty quickly. Whereas people in New Orleans, near the levees, are in a completely different situation, missing documents, suffering the full extent and fury of the storm, and some of these people are still waiting for their Road Home grant. So this is a graph I did, or a chart, looking at the parishes in Louisiana. The percent of the bar represents the number of units, home units that had suffered major or severe damage. And the line shows the percent of Road Home applications that were closed, that is the number of grants awarded by November of 2007. And what we see is that in the most devastated parishes, this is November, St. Bernard Parish, 19,000 of 20,000 damaged units, 19,000 of those suffered major or severe damage. By November, only 39% of these people had received a Road Home grant. You go to the center of the state, to East Baton Rouge, to West Baton Rouge, and you see that very few units had suffered major or severe damage, yet West Baton Rouge has got about close to the same percentage of people receiving a Road Home grant. In our interviews with people, we got to talk to a man in Gentilly. He had just finished fixing up his home. He told us his story, that he had basically had to rely on his own income, personal savings, other forms of of money to fix up his home. He was still waiting for his road home grant, though he had managed to somehow finance the repairs of his home. He talked about his frustration with the program and that he had applied the first day the program started in August 2006. And this is just one quote. He said, "We didn't get a response back from Road Home for 1.5 years. I know a guy who lives on the North Shore. This is towards the center of the state. He had wind damage. He applied a year later than I did. He got $70,000 from Road Home for damage he thought cost $15,000. He added a room to his house with the extra money. They were giving out money on the outer outskirts to people who had minor damage. What about people in the epicenter who lost everything?" Another feature of Road Home was the frequent policy changes. Road Home had hired an outside contractor, ICF International, to administer the program. And they have been just wrought with all kinds of problems, from underpaying to overpaying people, coming up with all kinds of complex policy rules and changing them. And this proves to be confusing not only to the administrators of the program, but to the people on the ground. Even the state auditor could not determine which changes had been implemented. The escrow account, I should give one example of frequent policy changes or policies that are unknown to even the people who administer the program. Something called the 60-40 rule. People who had selected the option of selling their home to the state and buying another one in Louisiana thought they were going to receive the full amount of the grant that they were going to be given. When they went to the closing table to sign the papers, they were told, if you don't find a house in 90 days, your grant's going to be reduced by 40%. Now, this was some sort of provision that was unknown even to the people who administer and run the program. That is, the Office of Community Development, the Louisiana Recovery Authority denied creating the rule, though it existed in the fine print. Back to the escrow account. This was removed at really HUD's nudging as of April of 2007. This was the account that said you have to produce receipts of completed construction before we let you draw down your funds. This led HUD to classify Road Home as a rebuilding and not a compensation program, and said, if you're going to go this route with the escrow account, you're going to be subject to federal environmental and engineering and all kinds of other reviews. So the state decided to back away from the escrow account in 2007. The funding shortfall, as I mentioned, including wind damage, led to all kinds of uncertainty on the ground. People just simply did not apply at some point because they feared that the program would run out of money. Another outstanding issue was the red tape revolving around the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. And these are FEMA funds that are set aside for home elevation projects. There was some sort of misunderstanding between the state and the federal government about how these funds should be used. Road Home promised people in October 2006, if you apply to Road Home, you may also be eligible for elevation money. We think we're going to have this extra allocation of funds through FEMA. So people began to apply. Some people began to elevate their homes before even getting any sort of indication that they'd get the grant. Later, the state found that this usage conflicted with federal regulations, and in particular, FEMA said they didn't like some of Road Home's penalties and exceptions, namely the exemption of the elderly from the 40% exit penalty. FEMA said discriminated against young people. There were other issues, and they said that we really have to do environmental and engineering reviews before we hand out these elevation dollars. So that led people to start elevating their homes in anticipation of grants. In many cases, they're still waiting for that. The point of the Road Home program seems to have been to engineer some sort of tipping point, that if we apply an exit penalty, we're going to get people to come back to Louisiana and rebuild their homes. But ironically, it seems to have done the opposite of that, making this very complex, bureaucratic program. The money has not flowed to the people who need it. In order to stimulate recovery, you want people to come back fast. Instead, the program has compounded uncertainty for residents. In making the decision of whether to stay or go, a resident has to see other people returning to know if it's beneficial. The people who came back to the neighborhoods early were in very risky situations. The utilities are not back on, people are not in the homes around them, it can be dangerous. So these early returnees are facing high risks. When payouts are slow to come and they're scattered all over the state and there's a lot of uncertainty about how well the program is funded, you're going to diminish any gains from any sort of exit penalty effects. And the longer people wait, the greater their opportunity costs go. Another outstanding question is really, in applying the exit penalty, did you force people to stay who may have been better off going to another state? They might have said, well, I don't want to get this exit penalty, I want to realize the full amount of the grant. Then you lock them into a path-dependent situation where now they've invested their money in rebuilding their home. There are people down there who they get to a certain point, they run out of funds, and now they're stuck, they've got to wait. So the policy lessons, disaster relief is not efficient. Insurance, ideally, is the right thing to deal with this kind of situation. And part of the problem was the lack of accurate flood maps. Some people did not insure because they were told not to. Better that private insurance markets are able to enter and offer flood insurance. Part of the situation was there was the assumption made that the levees would hold, and this is an assumption made inside the NFIP program. It does not calculate the residual risk associated with the levees potentially being breached. It's important to establish why the government is handing out disaster relief. What's the culpability? What's the cause and culpability? And in doing so, it's very important because that's how you can target more tightly, you can award quickly, and I would add, attach no strings to the dollars. It's not an opportunity for social engineering or for community rebuilding. Let communities rebuild themselves. Let individuals make the decision as to whether they should return or not. It's an issue of personal autonomy as well. I think, ironically, Louisiana would be rebuilding faster if they hadn't attached these penalties and if they had tightened the eligibility criteria and not covered wind damage. So my recommendation is primarily to look at what Mississippi did. That is, target people who suffered, who relied to their detriment on inaccurate information as to whether to insure or not. In New Orleans, you have the added catastrophe of the levees, and that there's some culpability there. And then if there's funds left over, maybe then you can think about extending them to other people. Some ongoing issues, my last slide. There was an issue about whether people who took a casualty loss deduction in 2005 would be taxed on their road home grant. And I know that there's legislation right now that's trying to address that. And finally, I think the last thing I'd like to mention is the issue of the buyout properties. Those properties that people sold to the state. There's about between 7,000 and as many as 12,000 properties that will be that Louisiana Land Trust now has ownership of, and the issue is how to dispose of them. And I would say that the best thing to do is to put them on the market. Rents are high in Louisiana, in New Orleans in particular, and this is a way to increase supply and let people bid on those properties and fix them up with the appropriate covenants attached to them. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Eileen, and thank you, Steve. Quite prepared to take your questions now. While you're thinking about questions, please take note of our little evaluation sheet there. It's very important to us that we get a feedback from you about the quality of the subjects and the presentations that we're putting in front of you. So please fill those in before you leave. Okay, questions? Yes, sir.
Steve, you recommended possibly moving the Coast Guard to FEMA from DHS. Where do you imagine moving them to, or would they be independent agencies?
That's a great question, and I'm not. And it's not what I answer in the paper. More imaginative minds than I might do better with that. I'd like the one comment I would make is I think that the Coast Guard's success during Katrina was very much a result of it being a fairly independent agency for much of its 111 years. So in that particular case, I'd like to see it end up someplace where it has some more independence. I was of two minds on the FEMA recommendation because one of the points I raised in the paper is that one of FEMA's problems over the years is that it's constantly been shuffled around in the bureaucracy and its mission has changed, and that kind of lack of stability is really a problem for it developing the sort of organizational cultural mission that it might need. So I'm a little that one. I can see both sides there, and where it might end up better is an interesting question. Again, I think more independence there would be a good thing. But I think the key thing with FEMA is trying to get it to a place where it has a very well-defined, specific mission, and it has some time to allow that mission to develop, and where that mission is, I think, one where it has much less of sort of hands-on, moment-to-moment role, and one where, even though its mission currently says it's responsible for coordinating relief processes, I would like to see it sort of doing less at the day-to-day level and more at the sort of planning level, and perhaps facilitating those conversations I mentioned between private sector and public sector responders. Where would be the best place for FEMA? I'm fairly agnostic on. I think that would depend upon factors that are beyond my expertise.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Interestingly, while you're thinking about a question, we did a study on FEMA in 1999, Jerry Allig and I, and what we were looking for at that time was a standout turnaround organization. The one we found was FEMA. Between 1990 and 99, it had gone from being one of the worst organizations in government to one of the best organizations in government, and then within a period of 5 years managed to go back to being one of the worst organizations in government. And there's an interesting study there. Ma'am, your question.
Talk a little bit more about your Walmart example. Their mission statement is quite different. It's called Making Profits. What was the relationship between Walmart and FEMA during this period of time? And has anyone looked at Walmart's profit and loss for those specific regions over the 2 years?
The answer to the first is non-existent, and non-existent to, in fact, dysfunctional. And since Katrina as well, again, FEMA and others made it more difficult for Walmart to do the things that they did by sort of trying to divert them and sort of trying to snare them up in red tape. And Walmart eventually sort of just through sheer force and the local folks saying no, let them through, sort of broke through that. Since then, Walmart has tried, I think, to work with FEMA to sort of engage in that kind of coordination that I was talking about. But Walmart's been frustrated by that process. It's had more luck working at the state and local level. Texas, for example, has been very much on the cutting edge of finding ways to integrate the private sector into their municipal disaster responses. But FEMA less so. It may be that FEMA's dealing with their own problems right now, and at some point we'll sort of engage that conversation. As far as sort of the profitability of those companies go, it's a really interesting question, and as I presented this paper to professional economists, they've asked a similar kind of question. I think part of the answer is it would be very difficult to tell in the several months immediately after, because so much of what they did was give stuff away. And what I think what Walmart folks have said is we're not that concerned about it. We had to do what we had to do, both because we thought it was the right thing, but also in the long run interest of our own business. As I said, their attitude was, it doesn't do us any good as a business if we don't have a community to come back to. So whatever we can do to rebuild this community is important. And I don't think there's any way, and this is not just a sort of blow off of the question, but I'm not sure there's any real way to calculate what the profit and loss was over that period. Their sense, what they seem to say, it's a wash, right? They had more business because people needed supplies, but they also gave a lot of stuff away. And their sense was that those two roughly equaled out. Over the longer haul, have they done well down there? Again, mixed bag. People need what they're selling, but at the same time, those economies, particularly New Orleans, have been hit very hard. You lost half your customer base in New Orleans and not quite that much elsewhere. So, but at the same time, they've been able to rebuild that Waveland, Mississippi store, which was utterly non-existent immediately after. There's now a brand new supercenter there, and it's doing well. So there's no easy answer to that question. Certainly, I think what Walmart and what Home Depot would say was if they had to do it all over again, they would do the same things that they did. So that suggests that it wasn't a huge loss for them.
One of the interesting studies there might be to look at that right across the country, because the goodwill generated in Louisiana flows on to Walmart and Home Depot across the entire country. Did I see somebody else had a question? Yes, sir.
This is Riley. With the road home funds in Louisiana, now that they've moved away from the escrow account, is there any data on what on the six and some change billion that's been actually dispersed? Is there any data on what's actually then been turned around and actually used for actual repair?
Good question. The Road Home program, one thing they've done well is kept track of the timelines of when they handed out the grants, but not precisely who's using it for what. You can get data by zip code. People who have selected what particular option in the program. You can get average amounts of grants awarded, but not specifically what they're using it for. But it should be used for home repairs. I know that's still.
Anybody else? Yes, sir.
You mentioned the national response to FEMA and then the private sector. How about state, local governments, and regional interstate compacts response to FEMA?
Yeah, I didn't look a lot at that. And one of the things we know about Louisiana was it was one of those, you got it, I take it things, where it wasn't clear. The state's response and the local response wasn't particularly terrific as well. From what I do know, the response by local authorities in Mississippi and Alabama and Texas to some degree were better. We certainly saw better performance during Rita than we did during Katrina. How much of that is due to the overwhelming? The thing to remember is what happened in New Orleans was just overwhelming. As bad as it was, say, in Gulfport or Biloxi or those places, things were damaged. But the sort of flooding 80% of a major American city is just beyond anyone's sort of strict planning process. And combine that with a state that's not known for having the most effective and ethically upstanding governments in the country. I think you had a recipe for the sort of disaster that you saw there. Other states responded better. I haven't looked at some of those differences and why that might be, but certainly knowing a little bit about what states seem to be doing now and heading in different kinds of directions, I think we'll see improved response at the state.
Yes, sir.
This is for Eileen. You talked a lot about the benefits of the Mississippi program to help the rebuilding effort. Can you talk to the kind of the bad side of it? If you noticed anything like fraud or any major issues that came out of that?
Mississippi. There was some talk of fraud and some contract fraud in Mississippi. I have not found a lot of general complaints about the Mississippi program. Our investigation did focus primarily on the New Orleans area, so focus was the Road Home program. But just keeping track of both programs in the news and in interviewing people, there seemed to be fewer complaints. That's not to say that fraud has not been committed in the Mississippi case. I think that there are a few examples of that, and that opens the argument of what percentage of fraud do you want to accept to some extent. The trade-off of fraud versus accuracy and speed. You probably have to build in some minimum amount of fraud is going to occur no matter what we do. And how do we just try to get money as quickly as possible to the people who need it is the question.
I would make the same point about other kinds of relief that we receive. I think Eileen's exactly right. And the more that we can empower local folks to sort of give them choices and options, the better. That probably will mean that we're going to tolerate a slightly higher percentage of fraud than we might for other kinds of programs. But that's going to be the evidence that she's presented about the time that people have waited to get help. It's just intolerable, and I think you just have to be willing to put up with some to get that result.
Yes, sir.
Two questions. The first one would be, as far as in trying to rebuild down there, admittedly local government can do things better, or the more local something is, it tends to be more efficient, less fraudulent, and everything else. I would say, other than the exception of the entire state of Louisiana. So, might there need to be a federal audit situation so that you can just get the systemic corruption out of it from Huey on forward? Just the audit function being federal, but everything else being locally done, because I've talked to some of the people who were in local areas that are actually more efficient at getting things done. Louisiana National Guard getting stuff out there, because they knew where to go, you had to do it, and they're just organized to do it. So not federal implementation, but at least federal oversight on the audit.
Yeah, I think you can comment as well. I would just say, as I suggested before, it's always difficult making the case for state and local government being the responsible actors when you're talking about Louisiana, but I think the principle remains, and perhaps the new governor down there might make some progress in cleaning things up. But they're not the only state that's vulnerable to these sorts of situations, right? And we've got other states with more reliable state local government where those sort of recommendations are.
I agree with Steve that generally you expect the state and local government to be more agile in these situations, more local knowledge. But what fascinates me about Road Home is even the uncertainty that you find today on the local level about what to do with buyout properties. The argument being that we don't want to put too many properties on the market, it will depress housing values. So even on the local level, there seems to be still this sort of delay. And I don't know if Morris has something.
One of the interesting things that we found in looking at FEMA in 1999, and it's interesting because that was FEMA pre-9/11 and it's FEMA pre the Department of Homeland Security. But James Lee Witt had changed the whole culture. And the culture now was about getting people's lives and communities back together as quickly as possible. And he said that he personally would take the risk for mistakes that were made. And one of the things that he said was that we have to get settlements from 12 to 13 weeks down to 3 to 5 days. And he got them down to 3 to 5 days. He actually did that by empowering the assessor to make the decision and FEMA would honour it. So the person who went in and looked at the damage, made the assessment, and FEMA would write the check. That took out 5 levels of supervision, and errors and mistakes went down by 20%. That's interesting, isn't it? You got the benefits of quick settlement, and all of that supervision didn't actually improve the results. In fact, it hindered the results. So in these circumstances, we just have to accept that a certain level of errors, omissions, and fraud has to be tolerated to be able to get the major good of other people's lives and communities functioning more quickly.
And that's similar to what you did back home. Sure. Yeah. On a private, second question is on a private comparison. Red Cross went in, they wanted money, just send us some money, forget all that other stuff, just get the bloody money in here. And then delivered this much service for the huge bucks they were bringing in. Salvation Army was taking money, but volunteers, products, goods, service, send it to us, we'll get it used, and seem to be getting this much money for every buck they were putting in. So is there anything in your experience as far as on the private sector between the big bureaucratic charity and then the effective, agile charity?
There was an earlier draft of the paper that had the Red Cross in that empty box, that private but centralized. And my feeling was I just couldn't come up with enough evidence to really substantiate making that argument. And my gut tells me it's exactly what you just said, which is that the Red Cross is very structured, very weird. Local offices sort of bring the resources in, but then it gets funneled centrally and dispersed somewhat more centrally. And so I just couldn't. We kind of said, no, we can't figure this one out to sort of make it as clear as we want. But again, I think you're exactly right. It's a national organization that meshed in the political process in many ways too, it took some heat in this, and in a way, like it's the sort of reverse of the Coast Guard, that sort of mirror image, and it did not perform well. And Salvation Army, and in fact, local, all kinds of local charities in New Orleans and elsewhere were much more effective. And there's some interesting work that Mercatus folks are doing now on the way in which other kinds of civil society organizations, churches, and other social groups were very effective in responding at very local levels. And I think that's what you see. And the Red Cross is a nice example of one that didn't work well because it was, I think, overly centralized and not agile enough to engage in the kind of response that is necessary.
If you look at sort of saints and sinners, you put Walmart and Home Depot in the saints column, but you might put the entire insurance industry in the sinners column. So not all private sector components work extremely well. Some of them work pretty much to their detriment, I would think, on the long term. There's a few insurance companies I would never use again.
Right, if you go down to New Orleans and say insurance company, you better run.
Well, no, but I mean, that's a systemic problem. They're set up to take all insurance premiums and deny all claims. I mean, they need to pay off.
Yes, ma'am. I'll take the question from you and then yours, ma'am.
One comment, one question. Hopefully, Red Cross has learned some of its lessons, having just let off, 2,000 people or something. Maybe we'll see some reorganization and be more responsive locally. You mentioned code. I'm wondering if going forward, we're still going to see some crises, weather aside. There was a tremendous shortage of skilled labor, and still is in the area. Some of those homes, many of those homes going up that would never meet code otherwise. We're not really prepared going forward to meet the next disaster.
I haven't followed how well they're enforcing code, but my understanding is that, you have the situations where people, and where people are not getting their elevation money and their mitigation dollars, they're not elevating, they're not mitigating, they're doing piecemeal work. The extent to which the inspectors are going around and seeing, issuing citations, I couldn't tell you. But I think, probably.
One thing I would quickly add to that is that, again, there's some trade-offs here, to get the skilled labor to build totally up to code. And if you ask people down there, this is a story they tell, that we brought people in to do this work on homes who aren't doing the kind of quality work that they should be doing, but to get them would cost a fortune, I think, under the current circumstances. And so the question is, how much of a trade-off are you willing to make sure people have a home to get back into, versus how strict the code is and what that's going to mean. I mean, I think elevating is probably the best thing you can do versus other kinds of things in the actual construction. But again, there's trade-offs all over the place under a set of circumstances that we've never faced before.
Ma'am, yours?
Yeah, this question is for Eileen. I wondered during your analysis if you considered the percentage of homes that were destroyed versus severely damaged and minor damage, because of the fact that in Mississippi, I think, first of all, we're dealing with 3 times as many homes were destroyed in Louisiana than they were in Mississippi, and that all affected the response to
That's certainly something Louisiana has raised, that we suffered a greater extent of damage. I would argue they also got a larger amount of funds. It's certainly true. And in the analysis, if you see the graphs, I only looked at the number of units that were severely damaged in Louisiana. And I think one thing that was interesting to me is that Louisiana did not focus the targeting in that way. They said, we're going to get to everyone who suffered damage. Call what you will. If your shutters blew off in West Baton Rouge, you can apply to the program, as opposed to people who were completely flooded right next to the levees. So yes, greater magnitude in New Orleans, but also the way they designed the program, it was almost the worst way to do it.
But now I'm curious.
There's also a duration of the flooding. The longer the building is underwater, and many of them were underwater for a long time in New Orleans, the less likely you are to be able to recover the building. So that was unique to New Orleans in particular, and not common in Mississippi.
Which could have actually played into the role of taking a longer time to recover. Which also then I wondered you had suggested that Mississippi had the program that you would like to emulate in Louisiana because of the fact that they had more experienced-sized posses. One of them being that they have to carry insurance. And I'm wondering now in Louisiana, where the most severe damage was, they probably would be able to insure themselves in that area, correct?
Well, I think the NFIP is going to be extended. They're redoing the flood maps, which are not quite done yet. So in some of the areas where you had people living where they told they were in a floodplain, these maps are being redrawn. So it's going to be a requirement going forward that they carry flood insurance.
Yeah, but so, I mean, if you were applying for this using the same standards as Mississippi, they might not have been able to rebuild because their home is now in an area that was probably uninsurable, correct?
Could be. I mean, this is all a question mark still, because people are rebuilding in these areas that are not that are in flood zones. It's a matter of how you rebuild. I mean, you elevate your home, you purchase flood insurance. Should you rebuild? It's sort of a personal decision. But in some cases, there's the uncertainty of where they're going to put green space in New Orleans and some of these areas, and they haven't really consolidated lots to determine where they're going to not rebuild and say this is a no rebuilding area. So I don't know if I've answered your question. But going forward, they're redrawing the flood maps, requiring people carry flood insurance if they're in these areas, and that's really all you can do, I guess.
It looks to me like insurance was your solution for this, but then the insurance was ineffective, right? So,
well, I would argue let private insurers enter into these markets. The National Flood Insurance Program is the federal government's program, and one of the major tragedies here is that the flood maps were not accurate because the incentives to update the maps were not present. Insurers have every incentive to get the best actuarial information about risk, and these maps are out of date. People are living in areas that clearly were flood zones, and also the National Flood Insurance Program did not calculate the risk associated with the breaching of flood walls and levees. So the information underlying the NFIP was not complete. So people who were insured under NFIP in effect had an incomplete policy. Even if you bought the maximum amount of NFIP, you get $250,000. On flooding and $100,000 on contents in your home. And these people suffered in excess of that. And the reason is that the information underlying it was not fully accurate. So I would argue let private insurers enter the market.
what is your recommendation for those people who are uninsured? It appears to me that
I would say if this is a harsh solution, but if you cannot afford to purchase insurance to live in a high-risk area, then you're undertaking risks that you're not going to be able to it's paid for when disaster strikes, and that's a hard reality. If you're going to live in a high-risk area, it's your responsibility to purchase insurance. Otherwise, I mean, the reality is...
I know I'm hearing what happens after
it's their choice. If you are going to put yourself right next to a levee, I mean, and this, I know it's an emotional choice for people. You know, I grew up here. I don't want to move. This is where I grew up. But you're living in an area that's sinking. You're living right next to a levee. Hurricanes are increasing in severity and in frequency. This is a risk of where you live, and
no, I understand and appreciate your argument. The reality is that you have these people to deal with, and what is your solution to deal with? And it sounds like the solution is not right. I mean, can you imagine the media response to 45,000 people, with nothing?
One of the things that FEMA was doing prior to becoming part of Homeland Security was that as disasters occurred, it was going through those disasters, looking at the results and deciding how it should deal with those communities in the future. In particular, properties that were built on the floodplain. And if FEMA had reconstructed your property twice, it would not do it again. You built there at your own risk. If it was a loss, then that was your problem. Whether you could get private insurance or not was something that FEMA wasn't interested in. And I think that sort of moral caution has to be in policy somewhere around. To answer your question as a politician, in the end, if people get wiped out like that, we're going to do something. But it shouldn't be there as an incentive to avoid doing what you're morally obligated to do, and that is protect yourself, your family, and your possessions.
And shouldn't the thing that you do is get them out of the harm? I mean, the entire thing of going back to rebuild the ninth ward is the most asinine thing in the world. It's a floodplain zone. It's a hellhole. It was a ghetto with terrible schools and everything else. Who the heck wants to rebuild that crappy lifestyle for people? If you're going to rebuild it, go someplace that's safe and better. If you're going to do it on the public dole.
I think and the other concern I have, just to emphasize something more said, which is the incentive effects of bailing people out who don't get the insurance, right? What's the incentive for others to buy it in the future? And there might be other things that we can do, whether it's providing some sort of, a smaller level loan to the uninsured to help them either relocate or rebuild or whatever, but to simply sort of, say, okay, well, you find yourself in a fortunate situation, we're going to cover your losses. And we're not going to go, wait a second, why should I bother down the road doing the same thing? And so I think you have to find a way to skate between the reality, the political reality of doing something, but the longer-term danger of sort of subsidizing behavior that's going to make this worse the next time.
And I think you could argue that people were living in these areas in Lower Ninth Ward, elsewhere near the levees, where they really thought they were safe because of the levees. Now we have new information. Levees were not safe. This should be part of the calculation. And yes, I mean, there's evidence. I know we have a paper by Dan Sutter that shows insurance regulations through the NFIP might have encouraged people over the years to locate in dangerous areas. So once you mask things with subsidies, or you say we're going to give you a gift, we're going to bail you out each time, you're essentially giving people bad information about the risks that they personally face. Then they don't mitigate. They think they're living in a safe place. I remember interviewing one of the first people I interviewed down there. He said, see, there's the levee. And he said, we thought we were safe. And as an outsider, I thought, what? I mean, I saw the coverage on TV. It's unbelievable to me that you were told you weren't in a floodplain and that this couldn't have happened. And yet the psychological, I think over the years, people reinforced that we're fine, we're safe. Levees are here, we'll survive the next hurricane. But if the public response is to encourage resettlement, then there's just going to be another disaster. People are going to lose their lives.
And I think one of the things that we're sort of thinking now about is that we're thinking about people's property, and you should be able to live where you lived before. We mustn't put aside the fact that 2,000 people died, and that's a major consideration. Personally, back in my own country, in my own district, where it got flooded in similar circumstances once, what we actually had to do was to declare most of those residences below the flood level as uninhabitable, and give people no choice. They weren't going to be allowed to live there any longer. Yes, sir, you had a question.
Well, it's actually just a comment to piggyback on what Eileen was saying. I think with the National Flood Insurance Program, it's not just with the map saying who is on and who is off the floodplain, but the program has built within it those that are on the floodplain a subsidy for properties that are pre-burned. And so FEMA has basically stated that they pay about 40% of 35-40% of what their actual risk is. And so with this particular program, I don't think it's just necessarily who's in, who's out. Also, who's in, they're not paying the actual risk. And so because of that subsidy, there's also, these people aren't necessarily seeing their true cost of living there.
That's exactly right. And that's something I meant by they were, even those who purchased the maximum amount, were not fully insured at the end of the day. Because one reason is that subsidy, you're right.
We now call this to a close. I thank you very much for your attendance, and I would like to ask you to join with me in thanking Stephen and Eileen for their work.